I'm so afraid. Give me the strength that I will.
You're not in prison for punishment. You're in prison because someone decided you needed to suffer first. Before you even understand what you're being accused of, you're shackled. No trial, no lawyer, no Miranda rights. Just the sharp clank of iron closing around your wrists, and maybe the back of a mailed fist driving you to the ground. In medieval Europe, the idea of due process didn't exist the way we imagine it today. Justice wasn't blind. It had a face, and it belonged to your lord, your bishop, or your accuser. And if they decided you were guilty, that was usually enough. Across 12th to 15th century Europe, arrests didn't require hard evidence. Sometimes it was a neighbor's whisper, a rumor in the marketplace, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. According to the assize rolls of King Henry II, men were routinely arrested on suspicion alone. If two jurors swore you were not of good fame, the sheriff could seize you without further explanation. Historian Sarah M. Butler, examining 13th century English coroners' records, noted that a surprising number of accused murderers were simply the nearest person at hand. They seized him because he was found near the body and could not give a good account of himself. Not because he was seen committing the crime, just because he was there. In many cases, there was no conventional trial, because the truth could be found in other ways, by ordeal, ordeal by water, ordeal by fire. These weren't metaphors. They were real procedures designed to extract divine judgment. In the ordeal of hot iron, you were forced to carry a red-hot bar of iron for 3 paces. Your hand was then wrapped and sealed for 3 days. If, when unwrapped, your skin showed signs of healing, you were declared innocent. If it festered, you were guilty. The 1215 Lateran Council condemned trial by ordeal, but it remained in practice in local courts, unofficially, for decades after. The ordeal of cold water was even crueler. You were tied and thrown into a river or well. If you floated, the water had rejected you, proof of guilt. If you sank, the water had accepted your innocence, though you'd likely drown before being pulled out. In parts of Europe, governed by canon law or under the influence of the Papal Inquisition, you might find yourself arrested for heresy, a crime not against people, but against belief. The Inquisitor's Manual, by Bernard Gouy, written in the early 14th century, was clear. Interrogation must aim to correct the soul, but it also authorized physical pressure. If you denied the charges too long, you could be tortured until you understood the truth. One chronicled account from 1311, stored in Inquisition archives, details a young woman tied in the strappado, hoisted by her arms and dropped until her shoulders dislocated. Her confession came only after 5 drops. These confessions weren't voluntary, they were mandatory. Whether you were innocent or not didn't matter. The system needed you to confess, because confession was how they ended the paperwork. Forget innocent until proven guilty. The default assumption in medieval justice, especially in secular courts, was the opposite. By being arrested, you had already proven something was wrong with you. The Constitutio Criminalis Carolina of 1532, a bit late for the true medieval period, but building on earlier practices, codified the use of torture in German lands. It stated that torture was permissible when the suspicion is well-founded. What defined well-founded? Often, hearsay. In English records, such as the 100 Rolls and Ayres, itinerant court records from the 13th century, there are thousands of entries where a person is held in prison not because they're convicted, but because they might be guilty. And once you were in the system had no interest in letting you go. Nobles rarely faced this kind of justice. They had private trials, personal advocates, and the luxury of ransom. In 1376, a noble named Richard Lyons was accused of corruption and treason. His punishment? A brief imprisonment followed by exile. Meanwhile, a poor man caught stealing bread could be imprisoned without hearing or timeline, or worse, handed over to the crowd for mob justice. According to court records from York Assizes, circa 1360, a 16-year-old boy was arrested for stealing a loaf. He spent 8 months in prison awaiting trial. By the time his name reappeared in the rolls, he was marked, died in jail. No conviction, no execution, just forgotten. If you think justice was about uncovering the truth, think again, Justice was about control, about maintaining order, and about showing everyone watching what happened when you stepped out of line. One statute of Winchester from 1285 ordered night watchmen to arrest anyone out after dark. No questions. Suspicion was enough. And if you were a foreigner or a stranger without local family, your fate was even worse. Many cities operated under frank pledge, a system where 10 men were collectively responsible for each other's conduct. If you didn't belong to a group like this, you had no legal protection. So your arrest might not just mean a beating and a cell, it meant disappearing. Forever. But here's the worst part. Everything you've just experienced, arrest, accusation, torture, shame, that's just the beginning. The real suffering hasn't even started, because now they throw you into the dungeon. And if you think that's just a dark room with bars, you're not even close. Next, we'll go underground, into the filth, into the stink, into the place where names are scratched into walls with blood and bone, because in the medieval world, being arrested wasn't the punishment, the dungeon was. You're chained to a stone wall, you haven't seen daylight in 3 weeks, your skin itches with lice, your stomach twists with hunger, and the only sounds you hear are rats and the screams from down the hall. Welcome to prison. In the medieval world, prison wasn't where justice ended. It's where it festered. These places weren't designed for rehabilitation, reform, or even punishment in the modern sense. They were holding pits meant to contain you until trial, ransom, or death. And for most, death came first. Today, a prison is a building with lights, plumbing, meals, and even medical care. In 13th to 15th century Europe, a prison was often just this: a stone hole beneath the courthouse. Sometimes it was a chamber under a castle gatehouse. Sometimes it was a pit dug into a city wall. London's infamous Newgate prison was little more than a medieval tenement crammed with disease and rats, with open sewers running through its corridors. A 1340s report from the City of London describes prisoners in Newgate lying naked on the floor, covered in lice, starving, dying where they lay. These weren't exaggerations. They were official observations by royal inspectors. There was no obligation for the crown or church to feed prisoners. In most prisons, you had to pay rent for your chains, literally called garnish. You paid for food, you paid for straw to sleep on, you paid the jailer for not beating you. In 1296, a man named William de Well was imprisoned in Lincoln Castle. Records show his family paid 2 pence per day to the jailer just to ensure he received bread and water. If no one brought you food, you starved. If no one bribed the guards, you were left chained in the dark, possibly for months. Chronicler Jean Froissart, writing in the 14th century, described English prisoners taken during the 100 Years' War who were thrown into pits and forgotten, often dying of thirst before the law remembered their name. Everything you touched inside a medieval prison could kill you. Stone walls soaked up human waste. Mold grew thick in corners. Lice and fleas covered every prisoner. Dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis all ran rampant. According to archaeological studies of Norwich Castle Jail, skeletal remains show signs of chronic malnutrition, scurvy, and broken limbs left untreated. In 2014, a forensic team analyzed exhumed bones from a medieval prison cemetery in York. The bones showed extensive infection and untreated fractures. Many of the deceased were young, some under 20, and bore evidence of restraint injuries. Grooves worn into the ankles from long-term shackling. There were no latrines, buckets overflowed, waste soaked the straw. You were sleeping in your own filth, often literally. Light was rare. Many dungeons were deliberately built without windows. In Caernarfon Castle, Wales, the prison chamber was dug below ground with a single ceiling vent. Prisoners lived in near-total darkness, leading to hallucinations and madness. One visitor to the Tower of London in the early 1400s wrote that prisoners wept at the sound of footsteps, thinking it to be death or judgment. Torches were only lit for executions. You lived, slept, and relieved yourself in pitch black. The oubliette, from the French oublier, to forget, was a special kind of prison cell, a vertical shaft, narrow, deep, with no door, just a hole above to drop in food, or not. Once you were lowered in, you were meant to disappear. Crowding was severe. You weren't alone, you were crammed together with strangers. In 1382, records from Chester Jail show 46 men locked in a single room, a space no bigger than a stable. You were often chained in pairs or groups to prevent escape. These gang chains meant you had to urinate, sleep, and even suffer punishments together. If one prisoner died, the others dragged his corpse until the guards noticed. In Tower of London inventories from the late 1300s, there are receipts for iron shackles with multiple wrist loops, one item simply labeled for 3 felons chained together. The psychological toll was immense. Some inmates tore at their own skin. Others begged the guards to kill them. In 1419, Winchester Castle Jail recorded 24 prisoners held during winter. By spring, 17 were dead. The register notes only damp as cause, but given what we know, it likely means exposure and disease. Prisons were also temporary mass graves. When bodies were too numerous, they were buried in shallow pits nearby. Archaeological digs outside Newgate and Norwich Castle have found stacked remains, often without coffins, bones broken, skulls cracked, and evidence of post-mortem rat damage. In some prisons, corpses were left in the cells for days because guards feared entering. Survivors often lived beside the dead until they, too, joined them. There were no funeral rites, no crosses, just dirt. Wealth changed everything. In the Tower of London, noble prisoners like the Earl of March or the Duke of Orleans were kept in upper chambers, heated rooms, and served by personal servants. Some even had books, fireplaces, and wine. In 1471, Edward IV personally visited the Duke of Somerset, who was being held not in a cell, but in a private chamber. He was served roasted pheasant the night before his execution. Compare that to the peasant girl in 1323, whose only luxury was a lice-infested blanket shared by 4 others. She was never tried. She died before her name was recorded. Justice in prison, as everywhere else, was for sale. Here's the final cruelty. Most prisoners never reached trial. In many cases, they were not yet convicted of any crime, just suspected or accused. But the months, even years, they spent awaiting judgment became a death sentence of their own. The Statute of Westminster, 1275, tried to fix this. It ordered that prisoners could not be held indefinitely without trial. But sheriffs routinely ignored it, or bribed the judges, or simply lost the paperwork, and so they waited, and died, and rotted. The Tower Hill execution rolls contain names marked only died before sentence. Prison was never the final destination. It was the holding pen. The real punishment, torture, mutilation, public humiliation, was still to come. The guards would fetch you when it was your turn. Until then, you sat in the dark, with lice, with rats, with your dead. And if you were lucky, you were called out. If not, you just faded. Next, we'll see what happened when your name was finally called, and how confession, truth, and justice were crushed beneath wheels, screws, and ropes. In a medieval prison, guilt was not something proved. It was something extracted with fire, rope, and steel. You don't get a defense, you don't get silence. What you get is a choice: confess to what they want, or die while trying not to. Confession was everything. In the eyes of medieval law, a confession was the ultimate evidence. Once you said the words, the case was closed. Judges didn't need witnesses. Juries weren't always summoned. Records were sparse, just enough to mark the outcome. Torture wasn't hidden. It was part of the process. The Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, about 1532, the official criminal code of the Holy Roman Empire, stated that torture was acceptable if half-proof existed. That meant some suspicion, some testimony, or a gut feeling from a judge. The logic: only the guilty would confess under pain. But pain makes everyone confess. These were not metaphors. These were real devices. And they were used. The rack, perhaps the most iconic. The accused was tied by wrists and ankles and slowly stretched until joints dislocated. Muscles tore. Tendons snapped. The victims screamed themselves guilty. The rack was in use in England at the Tower of London by the 1420s. A surviving inventory lists one device called the Duke of Exeter's daughter, a dark euphemism for the rack. The strappato, common across Italy, France, and Spain. The accused's arms were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted, then dropped suddenly. The force could dislocate both shoulders at once. Papal Inquisition records from Toulouse, 1308, describe using the strappado 5 times on a suspected Cathar heretic before he confessed. Thumbscrews and iron boots, smaller, more intimate horrors. Metal vices crushed fingers or toes. The iron boot, a cast iron shoe, was filled with boiling oil or wedges and hammered until bones shattered. In Germany, a surviving iron boot, now on display in Nuremberg's torture museum, was used in over 24 recorded trials between 1480 and 1520. Contrary to myth, age was not a barrier. In 1297, English court rolls from Nottingham record a case where a 12-year-old girl was tortured under suspicion of witchcraft. She was pressed, laid under a door, and loaded with stones until she named her accomplices. She died before sentencing. In Florence, during the 14th century witch hunts, inquisitors used strappado on elderly widows suspected of night flight and devilish communion. Records show women in their 70s suspended and whipped until they confessed to impossible crimes. No one was exempt, because torture wasn't about discovering truth, it was about enforcing conformity. Church interrogators used more than ropes and screws, they wielded spiritual terror. The Papal Inquisition prized psychological torture, isolation, silence, blindfolds for weeks, sleep deprivation, endless fasting. The 13th century Directorium Inquisitorum instructed interrogators to return the subject to the cell without food or fire, so that reflection and the grace of God might reveal the truth. Translation: lock them in the cold, in the dark, alone, until their mind collapsed. According to Bernard Gui, famous inquisitor of Toulouse, heretics sang truer than birds after weeks in solitary. He wrote proudly of obtaining over 300 confessions, not one of them witnessed by anyone outside the Inquisition. Confess, and you're condemned. Don't confess, and they'll find new tools. Recant your confession, you're now a relapsed heretic, punishable by burning. A prisoner in France, Pierre Maury, was tortured multiple times between 1318 and 1321. His confessions changed. He tried to retract one, then added another. Eventually, he said whatever they wanted, that he was a secret Cathar, that he'd seen the devil, that he worshipped at a goat's altar. None of it mattered. He was sentenced to lifelong imprisonment, in chains. He died nameless in a monastery dungeon. We don't need imagination to understand what this looked like. We have manuals, instructions, and testimonies. The Malleus Maleficarum, Pater to 1487, the most infamous witch-hunting guide, recommended stripping women naked before interrogation to look for devil's marks, and applying the strappado immediately after. Quote, let her be kept awake for a night and a day, and if in that time she has not confessed, then let the torture begin. In German Saxony, the Carolina Code required clerks to keep records of all torture sessions, who authorized them, which methods were used, and what the subject said. Some of these survive. One 1502 entry reads, subject did not answer after first strappado. Second application, he named Hans, the blacksmith, screamed God's name and begged for wine. Confession accepted. This was official, routine, and most importantly, legal. As always, wealth changed the rules. Noble prisoners, especially in England and France, were rarely tortured unless accused of treason. The Earl of Warwick, captured during the Wars of the Roses, was never interrogated under duress. He was held in honor, given books, servants, and eventually ransomed. Meanwhile, peasants were beaten into confessions about livestock theft. The poor were tortured not just because they were suspects, but because they were available. No one would defend them. No one could bribe the guard. Their names meant nothing. Torture wasn't always used to confirm guilt. Sometimes it was used to create it. A traveler in Burgundy, 1378, was detained at the city gate, no known crime, no accusation, but after 2 rounds of rack stretching, he confessed to plotting theft. City records show the confession was used to justify a pre-existing execution quota for that month. They didn't need justice, they needed a result. Don't mistake this for a broken system. Torture worked in medieval justice because the goal wasn't truth. The goal was order, obedience, and fear. The confession was just a tool, a formality. The real decision had already been made. Once you were arrested, the path only led downward. No one climbed out of the dungeon. Not really. But when your joints were broken, your spirit crushed, and your voice finally gave them what they wanted, then, and only then, did they move on to the next phase: judgment, punishment, public spectacle, and death. They drag you out of the darkness. Your legs don't work anymore. You're blinded by sunlight. And ahead, in the square, the crowd is already waiting. This is the moment they've been preparing for. Not to decide if you're guilty. That part's long over. This is to make an example of you. Because in medieval Europe, prison wasn't your punishment. Your punishment was what came next. Justice in the medieval world wasn't quiet. It was a spectacle. Cities, villages, even small market towns maintained public spaces where executions and punishments took place. The square in front of the Palais de Justice in Paris, the execution ground at Tower Hill, London, the gallows erected on the roads into Cologne. Everyone came. Merchants paused their trade. Children watched. The condemned were displayed, paraded, and humiliated. Because punishment wasn't just a sentence, it was a message. In 14th century England, city laws required that criminals be seen to suffer in full view of the people. Justice had to be visible to be effective. Death was the default sentence for serious crimes. In the London Assize rolls from 1300 to 1350, over 70% of recorded cases involving theft, arson, or rebellion ended in hanging. And it wasn't quick. Hanging was slow and agonizing. Ladders or carts were pulled away beneath you, and you slowly strangled, sometimes for minutes, convulsing as the crowd jeered or threw rocks. Burning was reserved for heresy and treason. It was a punishment meant to erase the soul. The condemned were chained to the stake. Fire was lit not with dry wood, but with damp faggots to prolong the smoke and pain. Beheading was for nobles, a cleaner death in theory, but many were botched. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587, not strictly medieval, but similar in method, took 3 blows. Drawing and quartering, England's most notorious punishment, involved hanging the victim briefly, then disemboweling them alive before chopping their body into 4 parts and boiling the head. The 1305 execution of William Wallace, recorded in the Chronicle of Lanercost, described his entrails being cast into the fire while he yet breathed. If you weren't executed, you were publicly branded, mutilated, or humiliated. Stocks and pillories were found in every town. You were locked by your neck and wrists or ankles, often left for days. Locals spat on you, urinated on you, threw rotten food. Records from York City Statutes, 1362, mention a baker locked in the pillory for selling bread light in weight. He was beaten with his own loaves. Branding was used to mark repeat offenders. Thieves were branded on the cheek with a hot iron. Prostitutes in France might be burned with an F for femme folle, mad woman. Ear nailing. A prisoner's ear was nailed to a wooden post in the town square. After an hour or more, they were expected to tear themselves free. London's Guildhall records mention this punishment used for perjury as late as the 15th century. Flogging, public whippings, sometimes while being walked through the streets, were common for petty theft, slander, or violating curfew. Justice was theoretically equal, but money rewrote everything. Wealthy prisoners could pay for commutation, a reduced sentence, or private punishment. In Venice, the wealthy could pay for house arrest, serving their sentence inside their villa. Nobles in England might receive a sealed pardon from the king for services rendered. One record from the pipe rolls of Henry III lists a nobleman who paid 100 marks to avoid mutilation. He was sentenced to stay in his estate, with no public notice, no loss of limb, and no shame. Meanwhile, a beggar accused of stealing a cloak would be flogged through the streets. Executions were choreographed. Processions, drums, public prayers, final speeches. Some condemned men gave last words, reciting psalms or denying their guilt. Some were gagged. Others defecated themselves on the gallows, to the crowd's laughter. In Paris, executioners were public celebrities. The Sanson family, who operated from the late medieval period into the French Revolution, were paid by the city and trained in anatomy. In Germany, records show people bringing children to executions to harden them. It was a lesson, a spectacle, a ritual of power, and it worked. Many executed prisoners were denied Christian burial. Hanged thieves were cut down and buried at crossroads. Heretics burned at the stake were dumped into pits. Heads of traitors were boiled, then spiked on city gates. The skull of Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, beheaded in the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, is still preserved in the cathedral. A warning, not a memorial. Most executed prisoners had no grave markers, no names recorded beyond a line in a court scroll. They vanished. Even after punishment, the prison often remained. Debt prisoners, those too poor to pay fines, could be sent back to jail after flogging or branding. Some lived the rest of their lives behind bars for owing a few pence. The 1388 English statute declared that he who cannot pay shall be held until payment be made. Some never left. Even freedom wasn't full. Branded, maimed, marked by the pillory, you carried your punishment on your body. One French legal writer in 1394 said, "It is not the rope nor the fire, but the memory of shame that endures longest." There was no appeal, no second chance. The purpose of medieval punishment was not to rehabilitate, it was to remove, silence, and terrify, to remind every onlooker this could be you, and that's the final cruelty of being a medieval prisoner. You weren't just chained, you weren't just tortured, you weren't just killed, you were used to send a message and then erased. Romanticize the Middle Ages all you want, the castles, the knights, the pageantry, but don't forget the people who starved in chains, who screamed on the rack, who died nameless in the dark, not because they were guilty, but because they were forgotten. History remembers kings and crusades, but look deeper, beneath the castle, behind the church. There, in the darkness, you'll find the real story.